Hey folks, Dust here, and it's time to continue my discussion on the playoffs, otherwise known as the champion stage, for the IEM Katowice 2019 Major. Now, I already did a part 1 video where I talked about the first day of quarterfinals matchups, and so I hit on FaZe versus Na'Vi, and of course Liquid versus INTZ. But here in part 2, I'm going to focus on the other two quarterfinals matches to take place the next day, which is Made in Brazil versus Renegades, and then Astralis versus NiP. Follow the same format of the last video where I'll talk about each team first, then talk about the head-to-head history if there is any, and then talk about the map veto and just kind of talk about how I think the matchup's going to go. Also, I will link down in the description below some different videos that relate to some of these teams and maybe talk about them in some deeper detail, and I'll try to reference that and kind of point you in that direction because, again, I want to try to keep these videos at least somewhat manageable in length, and so if I need to kind of fly through something and not go into as much detail as I want to, I would at least try to point you in the direction of a video that can give you a little bit more information if you're interested. So without further ado, let's hop into it by first talking about the Made in Brazil versus Renegades matchup. So I did a whole video about Made in Brazil when they decided to remove Stewie2K and Tarek and bring in Taco and Phelps, and then of course bring in Zeus as a coach. So if you want kind of my take on Made in Brazil before that move happened and my thoughts on the move and all that good stuff, then definitely check out that video. It's going to be in the description below. Just to kind of blitz through it though, obviously they made this change because they were a little bit disappointed with some of their results. They weren't necessarily hitting finals or getting super deep runs a lot of the time. They typically did beat teams ranked below them, though. It really was only Astralis that gave them a ton of trouble, and maybe some of the other teams kind of ranked above them. There was like one time they lost a best of 3 to Energy, but pretty much outside of that, any other best of 3 that they lost was to an elite level team that you would consider ranked above them. The problem was they just weren't climbing, and some of these players are used to winning or being the best team in the world, and so obviously you don't want to kind of just be content. You want to do what you think is best to try to take a step forward, to try to climb the rankings, and so their thought was to bring it to a full Brazilian roster and bring back Zeus as a coach, which just makes sense in the context that it felt like a lot of the issues that Made in Brazil had with the Stewie and Tarek lineup was the fact that they kind of broke down in chaotic situations because of likely communication issues. They could approach early rounds pretty well with established roles and defaults and maybe some set pieces, but in the tricky post-plant or retake scenarios or mid-round 3-on-3 situations, sometimes things could really break down. Part of it could be communication, part of it could be chemistry, part of it could be a difference in philosophy on how they want to approach certain situations. Whatever the case may be, they certainly did have their issues, despite the fact that they weren't really that bad. They certainly were still a top 10 team in the world, maybe perhaps even towards the top 5, somewhere in that 5th, 6th range. But yeah, they were definitely not getting where they wanted to, and so they did make this change to bring in these players. And this brings back essentially the 2017 lineup that had Phelps, where they had some initial success, a little bump in the road, then they had this run of several events where they won or came second place, and then it eventually kind of teetered out. They did bring on Bolts, but they didn't bring back Phelps just to kind of stand in for a major, and then they went back with the Bolts lineup, and that didn't work out, and that's how they got basically to where they were with Stewie, 2K, and Tarek once you fast forward a few more months. Again, I talked about that in great detail in my Made in Brazil video, which I'll put in the description below. So I'm really just going to kind of focus now on what they've done so far, which, of course, they didn't play a tune-up event like a FaZe or like a Team Liquid. Some of these other teams that made roster changes, Made in Brazil, have really just been shrouded in secrecy. Obviously, they've been practicing a lot and maybe boot camping and things of that nature. I certainly heard that Made in Brazil was tearing everyone up in the NA region in scrims before they went to their boot camp, including Team Liquid, and some of the other teams talked about how scary they really looked in scrims. But outside of that, there was really no thing to look into to feel how they would play, unless you just want to kind of go back to the lineup with Phelps from 2017 and maybe try to draw some conclusions on, you know, what they might be good at or what style they might try to use if they want to kind of do a throwback to how they used Phelps in the past. But personally, I kind of hope they wouldn't do that. I hope they would kind of make Phelps more of a featured player and kind of make sure they implement him properly to make sure they get the most out of him rather than putting him in roles that don't make sense and then the team kind of falls apart or doesn't perform as well as it could. And so a lot of it has just really been speculation up until actually watching them play in the Legend stage. And in the Legend stage, I would say that it was a mixed bag in the sense that the result itself was fine. They went out 3-1, but there definitely were some troubling signs here that you saw throughout. So, for instance, their opening game, which is the game that they lost against Cloud9 on Inferno, they looked real rough in that debut. It did not look good at all. You know, just a lot of indecisiveness, this really sloppy CS, just didn't really seem to execute very well, weren't trading efficiently, losing their duels, players not performing that well. It was definitely just felt like maybe there was some rust in an official match setting maybe for some of these players, or at least as a team, and it just didn't look good at all. Then they went and they beat Complexity on Mirage. Granted, you don't gain a lot of credit for this because of all the struggles complexity we're having leading into the major. Indeed, outside of complexity beating energy in that upset best of 3, they still didn't really do all that much in this major, though they did certainly at least not go 0-3 as most people predicted. So the complexity win was good, but again, it wasn't against a big level of opposition. Then you go into the G2 game where they were able to get some revenge on Inferno, I guess you could say, just because of how poorly it went against Cloud9. They were able to get the win here, and then they did 2-0 NiP. So the 2-0 against NiP, that's pretty legit, right? I mean, they did have some bumps in the road in that game, but at the very least, you beat, I guess, one of the better teams, you could say, in the Legend stage. Certainly, it wasn't like an Astralis or a Navi or a Liquid or some of the elite teams in the stage, but NiP, a pretty decent team, and so not a bad 2-0 victory to get there. From what I've seen so far from Renegades Brazil watching them play, it's hard to still really know what they're going to be as a team because I actually didn't get to see them play that many T-sides. I mean, if you'll remember, the only T-sides really you get to watch them play was Inferno. On Mirage T-side against Complexity, they didn't really have to do much because they did well enough on CT side. They got a hot start by winning Pistol and kind of winning the first gun rounds and messing up Complexity's economy. So you didn't really get to see them do a whole lot on that Mirage game. And then even the Train game that they played against NiP, I mean, they had such a big CT side and, again, one T-side Pistol. And so, again, they didn't really play that many gun rounds on the T-side. So it's still a bit of a mystery to me on what their T-sides are going to look like. Certainly on Inferno, they had some well-established defaults and they had some set positions, so you could kind of see the roles and how they were shaking down. They look pretty similar to what the team looked like in 2017, or at least what some of these players have done in the past on previous teams. Like Taco was playing the apartments, I've seen them do that a lot. First, still playing Boiler. Cold Zero was still kind of floating between helping attack B and middle. Fallen, obviously, kind of a float as well with the AWP, or kind of helping middle or helping attack Banana as well. And then Phelps was their primary point man on helping try to get entries on Banana. This is a good use of Phelps. That's exactly the type of role you want to put him in. But yeah, the issue is that they just weren't really trading efficiently. They were having their issues. They didn't look scrambled or disorganized, something that I kind of talked about with FaZe, where they didn't seem to be on the same page. But yeah, they were just struggling to be effective in getting the openings they needed and getting the trades they needed. They had a few rounds that looked good. Again, they never really necessarily looked lost. They definitely, played pretty methodical, pretty default, pretty, map control centric, which is kind of how T-side Inferno usually gets played. So they didn't look sloppy, but again, they just weren't necessarily effective on some of these T-sides on Inferno. And it is true that this is one of the maps that this team did struggle on until they kind of got Tarek and Stewie into the team. That's when they kind of started turning Inferno around. But remember, this was a problem area for them in the past, which is part of the reason why they had their struggles and did make roster changes. I felt like Inferno was a factor. So that is something to definitely keep our eye on going forward. Now, Mirage is one of the maps that they actually were really good on when they had Phelps on the team in the past. The combination of Fur and Phelps is kind of an entry duo, particularly their effectiveness at getting control of middle and maybe attacking window room or connector. This was something that was a big part of their identity. And you could see that they were doing some of that, but actually in the complexity game, they were mostly just doing like fast-paced A execs or maybe some fast-paced B execs. They didn't really default and play mid-control very often. It was more of just kind of an up-tempo, fast-paced execute style of CS, using people like Fur, Taco, and Phelps to a degree as entries, with Cold and Fallen kind of following it up. And so I didn't really get to see truly how they're going to set up the pieces on their default Mirage. It's still very much a mystery to me how that's going to look. And then their Train, again, I didn't get to see them play enough T rounds to really know how that's going to be either. So far, it felt like they were using Phelps in the right roles, like as an entry or secondary entry type guy in a more aggressive fashion, and not putting him in support roles, which I think makes a lot of sense. And everyone was kind of doing what they want to do. Cold, could be very active in mid-round situations, still could fall back to the late round. And he was always a guy that, even if you felt like he was more of a lurk or a baiter or more of a mid to late round player, on maps like Overpass in particular, as well as Mirage, he could be more involved in the actual main map control group. And you still saw some of that in some of these games. But again, a lot of it is still speculation on how they'll truly look going forward. What you can look at is, of course, the individual performance of these players, and Cold is absolutely smashing it so far this tournament. He's exactly where you want him to be as far as level of performance. Fallen has also mostly been fine, and that's definitely a good sign to see, because I feel like this team has been at its best when Fallen's been able to be impactful with the AWP on top of his, really good shot calling. But I will also say he hasn't been tested a whole heck of a lot when you think about the level of opposition. And he did have some off games, versus NiP and Cloud9 on Inferno, which, of course, those are maps where it can be harder to have impact with AWP, particularly on the T side. So it is what it is. We'll have to kind of keep our eye on it going forward. Fur looks super sharp in the best of 3 against NiP, I will say, but did struggle in some of the best of 1s. So I'm still not really sure where he's going to be at. I mean, I know he did have his struggles kind of before he went and had his medical procedure that he most recently had before the preparation for this major. So I'm not 100% sure what to think about Fur, but at least he looked really good in that NIP best of 3, and that's definitely a good sign. Taco's been fine. He's been where you expect him to be. Phelps is the one that's mostly struggled, though. To be honest, outside of that complexity game on Mirage, he really hasn't hit his stride. He plays an important role, kind of being one of the guys that help create openings. So this is definitely a problem area to maybe keep an eye on for their matchup against Renegades, and if they go further in the playoffs, is how well can Phelps play. Because, again, they're trying, it seems to me, to put him in spots where he should be most effective when you think of his history with, like, Immortals and Tempo Storm and things of that nature when he was at his best. But, yeah, he definitely just, wasn't hitting his shots as much. I mean, he wasn't, like, terrible or anything like that, but he wasn't really hitting that ceiling you think he probably should have when you consider the potential we've seen out of him in the past. So these are all things to kind of keep your eyes on. But now I'll talk about Renegades. So Renegades obviously came into this event having taken care of business as usual at another Asian minor, doing well in the online leagues in the North American region, as they often have. And they did okay at these EPL finals. I mean, they had wins over Vici, Big, and G2, and had a close series loss to Mouse Sports. But granted, this was a G2 lineup that was using assistants and Smiths, so that takes away from it a little bit, but still not all in all a bad showing. But they also had several showings that weren't so good, like going out really fast at IEM Chicago, including an upset loss to LDLC. Or looking at the Toyota Masters, where they were really only able to beat on the smaller teams and lost, and they played some of the more name value teams like a Heroic or a Tyloo. And then after that, you had to go kind of really far back to like Starlighter Season 6, where they had some cool best of 1 wins over Tyloo, Complexity, and Imperial to make it out of the group stage, but then lost immediately to Optic, a very troubled team in a best of 3. So you really couldn't expect too much from this team coming into this tournament just based on some of their recent results. I mean, they had a couple of okay results. Maybe you could think, they could maybe do decent in the Challenger stage, but it was hard to see them have like a crazy deep run at the major. But they brought Kassad back as a coach. They obviously now have been playing with this lineup for a little while at Gratisfaction and Liaz. And, I mean, JKS has been playing really, really well again. He's definitely been back in razor-sharp form. Azur's been fine, as well as leading. At least I think he's still leading. I know he was right after Nifty left. I think that is certainly still the case. Gratisfaction has mostly been fine. He's a little bit of a mixed bag, which you don't want in an opper. You would want someone who's really stable and consistent, but he plays well more often than not. It's just he's not always like a monster-level player. I think Jacob has been really good lately. I think that's been one of the factors that has really helped this team. I think when they made the roster move, they've actually gotten Jacob in more active roles. He's more of like an secondary entry with Azur. And so I think that because of that, he's maybe in something that suits him a little bit better. Maybe he's a little bit more comfortable having played with the team for so long. He seems to be one of the guys that really add value to a guy like Azur, to a guy like JKS, to get them the firepower that this team needs to be successful. Liaz is certainly struggling a bit. I'm not sure what's up with him. He was playing really well in the Aussie scene when he was playing with like Order and Atletico and Kings and some of these other teams. It seemed like he had really, really good numbers and looked like a prospect, but on this team he's been a bit of a drag factor. Granted, he plays more supportive type positions. Maybe he's not playing the same roles he played before. I didn't really study his film back when he was on Order and stuff like that, so I can't know. But he is a little bit of a drag factor. But again, that's not really necessarily playing crucial roles for the team. But this team has surprised massively at this major. They blitzed through the challenge stage 3-0, including beating some of the better teams there, like NiP and Ints. And then the legend stage, they also went through really fast, only losing to Astralis. And they did take a map off of them, but they beat Ints again. They beat FaZe. They were able to beat Vitality 2-1. So they have looked really, really sharp. They've been showing some good ability on several different maps, like Cache, Mirage, and Train. They don't play much nuke, and their overpass has been a bit weak. Their Inferno has been good at the major so far, but before the major was a little bit of a mixed bag, and they've only played their dust to a small amount. So I don't really know their map pool too much, but they certainly look strong enough on Cache, Mirage, and Train, and so far they look good on Inferno at the major. JKS is smashing it as usual, Az is playing really well. Could use a little bit more from them, though, if they want to be able to beat Made in Brazil and make a deep run, but he's playing mostly good. Jacob, again, has been really good outside of the Astralis games. And so definitely they seem like they're in prime position to maybe pull off a victory here against Made in Brazil. I think that They even look good just from an eye test. Like, they're really good at simple, basic default CS. The roles are well established. They have good routines and protocols to handle, early and mid-round situations. They have some good executes here and there. They use their utility well. They're definitely a really well-balanced team in the sense that they, again, have these established defaults to be the foundation of their playbook, but then they can, do some pretty nifty little executes here and there across their map pool. Again, it's more of like Liaz and JKS playing the edges of the map, more of Jake and Azaz, kind of your guys fighting for main map control, and then Graz Faction, of course, being that AWP. They're actually a breath of fresh air to watch compared to some of the other teams that have looked really dodgy on their T sides. And this team alongside, Astralis, Liquid, ENTS, and a couple of other teams have actually been some of the best looking teams strategically. When you think about the head-to-head with Made in Brazil, there's none really to speak of due to the massive roster changes, so I'm not really going to get into that. When it comes to the veto, both teams have been leaning towards Inferno so far this event. Made in Brazil will likely continue to stay away from Nuke, I would imagine, so that's one note. I would imagine Renegades will likely stay away from Overpass per usual, but they could gamble it because they haven't seen Made in Brazil play it, but it's very unlikely. It seems like Made in Brazil are really favoring Inferno, but we never know what pick they might be sitting on because we just haven't seen them play enough yet to really know what their map pool is going to be. Maybe they could try to pick into a map like Dust 2 or Renegades haven't played it as much, and maybe try to attack that instead of an Inferno. Or I think Renegades will probably stick with maps like Cache and Mirage, but those are maps that historically this team with Phelps from Made in Brazil was quite comfortable playing. So that was actually one of the big switches the team made, was to get good at Cache, and then Mirage was really strong with Phelps and Fur. So you might be picking into the comfort zone of Made in Brazil at that point, so I'm not really sure what they want to do. But I feel like Inferno is definitely going to get played as either a pick or as a third map. When it comes to how I think this match is going to go, I think this is the hardest game to predict in the quarterfinals. I mean, I think that maybe Navi versus FaZe could be a little bit hard to pick, but with the way FaZe is playing, I feel like Navi is going to edge that. And I already talked about that in the part 1 video, but this match is, man, it's super juicy because you have a team Made in Brazil who you still don't really know anything about with this lineup because they've only played just a handful of games. So a lot of it is speculation or basing it off of what you think they might do based on what they do with this lineup in the past. So that's the big thing. And then the other big thing that makes it even harder is because of that factor, because I don't know much about Made in Brazil yet, I know that Renegades is playing super strong so far this major. This is some of the best CS this team has ever played. This looks like the best version of Renegades for the most part, other than maybe when they had like NAF and Nifty still on the team, they had some pretty good showings with that team. But this team has really looked so sharp, and I think it would be easier for me to just call a Made in Brazil victory if it wasn't for that fact that Renegades have really turned up to this tournament and played really well. The problem is I just feel like, Made in Brazil have those veterans. They have major winners on this team. They know how to make deep runs at majors. They've done it time and time again, and they have at times been the best team in the world or one of the best teams in the world. And this team has even kept their grit in majors in stand-in situations. Like, remember when they had Fox standing and they still had a pretty deep run at a major? When they had to bring Phelps back when they made the Bolts move for a major, they still were able to have a pretty good run there. So they always seem to find a way to win in these big tournaments like this. And so I think you have to give the slight nod to Made in Brazil, but based on how well Renegades have been playing, it could be more of a 55-45 situation to a 60-40 situation. I could very easily see Renegades perhaps pull off the upset and go into the semifinals, but it's hard to pick against a team of veterans like Made in Brazil, especially since from an eye test they look okay enough. It's just the individual form needs to be there, and we need to figure out what their map pool is going to be. So next up, it's going to be Astralis versus NiP. And so we'll start with Astralis. Now, it goes without saying that Astralis are the undisputed #1 team in the world, and they're perhaps the greatest team of all time in CSGO history. At worst, they're #2 on the list, and they are probably #1 already, but certainly with the good run at this major would basically kind of establish themselves as the best team of all time. They've been to 17 LAN events, they've made 13 finals, and they've won 10 titles. They've only placed outside of top 4 a single time, which is their first event together. Also, one of their top 4 finishes is in their first 2 tournaments. So they've made 13 finals and won 10 titles in their last 15 events. And they won 4 events in a row before they lost the iBuyPower Masters title to Team Liquid. They led 2018 in virtually every team category. They have a ridiculous map win rate of around 78% out of over 160 maps played. They've only lost 10 best of 3 or best of 5s out of 54, so they're at an 82% win rate on series played. There have only been 3 instances in their entire history with this line that they've been shut out in a series. All of their players are great. I mean, obviously the HLTV top 20 ranking is a bit controversial with all 5 of them being in the top 20, but certainly all 5 of these players are some of the best in their respective roles. I think a lot of people would say Glade's the best in-game leader right now, just as from a tactician standpoint. He's also quite a good fragger for that role. Obviously, Device, one of the best oppers as far as just being steady and reliable, particularly on CT sides, and being super mobile. Maybe not as flashy as a Simple, but just someone that you can kind of depend on and build around a little bit more. And then, yeah, Magus, I think, is a super good peripheral player. We know how clutch Ipix is, and we know that someone like Dupree is one of the best entry fraggers out there right now. I think maybe three, but at least two of these players are legit superstars, thinking about Device and Dupree, and then I think Magus you could certainly make an argument for. So definitely really great players, and they have an insane map pool. 40-10 on Inferno, and 4 of those losses were their first 4 games. So they're actually 40-6 in their last 46 games played on Inferno offline. Obviously the 29-0 streak on Nuke, which is the second longest map streak in CSGO history. They're 14-2 on Dust 2, and they have many one-sided wins on that map, and they've looked pretty solid in the past on maps like Mirage and Overpass, but they have slipped on those maps a couple of times recently, so maybe they're leaking a little bit, but still overall quite good on maps like Mirage and Overpass, and they just rarely play Train or Cash, but still positive. They're also just the most complete team tactically. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Again, they have some of the best established roles and defaults in CSGO right now. They innovate with these nade stacks and some of their utility usage and some of their executes, while also having mastered default CS and reacting to mid-round situations. It's just this team is like almost perfect. It's hard to find flaws in this team, and they are just so damn good. And I did some more content about how good Astralis are on this YouTube channel. I'll definitely link that in the description below. It's just everyone already knows how great they are. I've given you some supporting information towards that. I don't want to go through all their stats. It's just stats porn, bro. Like, when you look at it, it's actually unreal when you comb through it all. But I've given you a few points, and you definitely know that this team's sick, and they obviously did just fine so far this major. I mean, they did drop a map to Renegades, but it was business as usual for this team. Definitely never really looked shaky. And then we look at NiP, and of course I already talked about this team a good bit in one of my preview videos for the major already, when it was more towards like the Legends and Challenger stage, so definitely you can check that out. Yeah, obviously this is one of the teams that coming into the major, they hadn't played as much as some of the other teams like late in 2018, but had some good results here and there, like a top 4 at DreamHack Masters in September, only losing to Astralis. Making it past Challenger stage to the Face It Major and just narrowly losing to Main Brazil for a Legends slot. They also, took top 4 at ECS Season 6 with a close loss to Astralis after beating Energy in North. And they also came second at Blast Copenhagen and Navi after beating Astralis in a best of 1 and beating Main Brazil and Cloud9 in groups. Tough time in Lisbon, but it still just feels like this team's good enough to do as well as they did, which is make top 8. I mean, there was a couple of troubling moments in the Legends stage. I mean, they did beat Energy right off the bat on Nuke. They lost to Team Liquid on Overpass, fair enough, but then they battled back by beating Hellraiser. It was really only that best of 3 loss to Made in Brazil. That was tough. And then, yeah, Vitality, they had to kind of weather a storm to get through it because they did drop a map in the middle there, but they still ultimately did get the victory, right? Overall, this team has shown some ability on maps like Mirage, Train, Overpass, and even Nuke. They do really struggle on Inferno, though, which is a big strength for Astralis, which is a big problem for them going into a veto situation. And they also don't really have that many games on Cash and D2. Now, Cash probably isn't much of an issue because Astralis don't really play Cash much either. But the fact that they don't play that much Dust 2 and they struggle on Inferno, these are big attacking points Astralis can do to this team. The other big issue is while Forrest has played lights out this major, no one else has been a consistent factor for this team. Like, Lekro plays okay for his role as being an in-game leader, but he's not crazy impactful and not necessarily a superstar. Rez has the ceiling to be a superstar, and he has played really well in some of the games in the major, but he certainly can't have his off games. He can still have an off map every series he plays or something like that. It's not like he's that super dependable star player, that rock you can rely on, like some of these teams have, Astralis, Liquid, even FaZe with Nico. Like, all these teams typically have at least one guy is going to be your big breadwinner, and Rez should be that for NiP, but again, I feel like he's a little bit less consistent than some of the star players for other teams in the top 10 of the world. And while First has been playing really well and Rez has the ceiling, I do feel like sometimes they really lack a bit for firepower. Like, Get Right still isn't that much of a factor. Dennis has really struggled a lot. So I think that's the other big problem for this team outside of some of the map pool holes, is the fact that you don't really know what the individual performances are going to be for some of these players. I think they look good enough from an eye test as far as their strategy and stuff like that. They actually look way better than their counterparts in like a Fnatic, and they certainly look a lot cleaner in their setups than a team like FaZe. I think that they play the basics really well. They do have somewhat established roles, so they do kind of play a little bit of, I guess, musical chairs with the op between Forrest, Dennis, and even sometimes Lekro. It seems like Forrest is more of like the opper for T sides, and Dennis is more CT, but even that's changed up sometimes. So I think that's one other point of contention for NiP is this situation where I feel like Forrest is forced to primary op on T sides, where I feel like he'd be much better off as like a secondary entry. So that's the one thing. The other big thing is Dennis is a lot of the time trying to be the one creating openings alongside a Rez and a Forrest, and if he's not performing really well, that's going to really cause you a lot of problems creating those openings that you need to be successful. So that is, you know, really some big things to think about. But again, I think overall, tactically, they're okay. That isn't really the issue. The issue is more the individual performances. Now, when you think about these teams head-to-head, it is certainly true that they have had many close games, but they're mostly best of ones. They haven't played that many best of threes against each other. So, many close games, but Astralis has won the bulk of them, and they've won the 2 best of threes they've played against one another. When it comes to the veto, Astralis has first banned Cash or Train versus NiP most times. This is just covering a weakness of Cash, which is something they always tend to ban. But, you know, Train is their other really least played map aside from Cash, and a map that NiP can very much play and have beaten Astralis on that map. Now, for NiP, they've usually first banned Dust 2 in both best of threes, but that means they've left Nuke on the table both best of threes, which they've lost it each time they've played it. So this is getting back to that hole I was talking about in NiP's map pool, where they don't really play Dust 2, they struggle on Inferno, and Astralis are literal gods on Nuke. So it's like, pick your poison. Do you leave Nuke on the table and take an L like you did the other 2 best of threes so you can ban Dust 2 and cover that weakness? Or do you finally have to go ahead and ban Nuke, but then you leave open Dust 2 for Astralis? And unless you've been working on something crazy on Dust 2, Astralis can really look to exploit you in that fashion. So this is a big decision NiP has to make. I feel like no matter what they leave on the table, it's a guaranteed map for Astralis between a Nuke, a Dust 2, or Inferno. Now, NiP will likely look to attack Train if Astralis do a Cash ban, but they also might look to a comfort like Mirage and Overpass. These are maps they have beaten Astralis on in the past, and these are some of the maps that Astralis has slipped up on a little bit. And so maybe they could look to try to go for Mirage or Overpass, but again, I think Train is likely the target if it's available, but Astralis could ban it, and then it's up to NiP whether they want to decide to play Cash or not, even though they don't play it that much. No matter what happens, I just don't see a way Astralis loses this series. I'm just going to put it as simple as that. I think I've laid out the reasons why already and what I've talked about. I don't think there's really any need to elaborate on it much more. Anyway, I hope you folks enjoyed this video. Please subscribe for more content. Check out part 1 of this to look at the other quarterfinals matchups and see my preview on those, as well as, again, there will be links in the description below to some other content that I think maybe you'll find that relates to all this and that you'll enjoy. And then, yeah, just subscribe for future content as well. I'll definitely probably do some more stuff on the semifinals and finals as the major progresses. So without further ado, this is us signing out. Until next time, catch you later.